Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. And since I finally got away from doing work for Mr. Z, I decided to just take it easy and do a normal, reasonable video. Nothing crazy, just a nice, simple scenario. So, let's talk about Mussolini. The year is 1943, and ever since 1922, Italy had been under the control of its fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, who, after Italy's lackluster gains following the First World War, dreamed of conquering a new Roman Empire. And so, not long after taking power, Mussolini pretty much immediately began taking action to achieve this goal, particularly in Libya. Libya had been under Italian control ever since 1911, and the Italians had been eyeing up Libya for several decades before that, wanting to take its piece out of the collapsing Ottoman Empire. So, in 1911, after the outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War, Italy would launch an invasion into Libya, hoping to easily be able to capture the territory. But no. Instead, the war ended up in brutal trench warfare, leading to many casualties, becoming a costly endeavor for the Italians. And even once they had managed to finally take the territory, there was still the problem of keeping it. The colony pretty much immediately began to revolt, with many Arabs taking up arms against the Italian occupiers. And after Italy joined the Entente during the First World War, fighting would ramp up as the Senussis, a Muslim religious order largely centered in Libya, began to launch a full revolt with help from the Germans, hoping it would deplete Italian resources, starting the First Italo-Senussi War. And after a couple years of fighting in the sand, Italy grew exhausted and so was forced to give Libya practical independence, though with a nominal Italian presence. But even then, the fighting would still continue. However, in 1922, along comes Benito Mussolini, rising to power with his new fascist movement, taking control of Italy and deciding to put an end to the revolts in Libya, bringing it back under complete Italian control. However, this was a lot easier said than done. Mussolini sent troops into Libya in 1923 to crush the resistance, starting the Second Italo-Senussi War and committing numerous dehydrations along the way. During the war, thousands of Italian settlers were sent over to Libya, resulting in enormous growth of the Italian population there, helping to bring the colony under Italian control. And by 1932, Mussolini had managed to take complete control over Libya, crushing the resistance and solidifying his rule. After the war, Libya would be completely restructured. The new governor there, Italo Balbo, reorganized the colonies in Libya into one singular unit, creating the colony of Italian Libya. And under Mussolini's rule, Libya would see massive economic growth, with huge public works projects being undertaken, leading to even more Italians to move to the colony, with Libya being dubbed as a new America for Italian immigrants, with the Italian population in Libya reaching over 100,000 by 1939, over 12% of the total population. However, Mussolini still faced the issue of keeping the native Libyans on his side. Mussolini began enacting policies to support the local Muslim population in Libya, such as building Quranic schools and mosques, supporting pilgrims to Mecca, and even creating a high school of Islamic culture in Tripoli, as he began referring to the Muslim population as Muslim Italians. And in 1937, Mussolini would make a state visit to Libya in which he would have himself proclaimed as the protector of Islam, which, in his mind, made him the heir to the authority of the Caliph. Then, Mussolini was gifted with a symbolic sword known as the Sword of Islam and made a declaration that he would protect, quote, peace, justice, wellness, and respect for the laws of the Prophet. And the very next year, a statue would be built in Tripoli dedicated to Mussolini, whose base read, quote, to Benito Mussolini, peacemaker of the people, redeemer of the land of Libya, the mindful population and exhibitions where the sword of Islam flashed consecrate in the sign of the lictor, a loyalty that challenges the destiny. Even beyond this interesting event, Mussolini had also given some support to pan-Arab movements, though primarily as a way to challenge British and French domination in the Middle East. And so, over time, this, as well as him crushing the Libyan resistance, would lead Mussolini to gain some level of support from the Libyan populace. Then, in 1940, shortly before the fall of France, Mussolini would begrudgingly give his support to Hitler, joining World War II, forming what then became known as the Axis powers. Mussolini took this as an opportunity to launch numerous campaigns in the Balkans and North Africa, but famously performed very poorly, requiring immense German support in order to make any progress whatsoever. In particular, Libya would become a center for the war during the North Africa campaigns, as the Axis, under the leadership of Erwin Rommel, would wage war against British Egypt. The Allies and Axis pushed each other back and forth a couple times over a few years, until, in 1942, after the American entry into the war, the Allies would make a landing into Axis-occupied Algeria and ultimately force the Axis out of North Africa. And by May of 1943, the Allies launched an invasion of Sicily, with the Italians, not too fond of being invaded, turning against Mussolini for continuing the war. And a few months later, on July 25th, 1943, Mussolini would end up being deposed, with Italy changing sides, joining the Allies, and Mussolini being thrown in prison in the Hotel Campo Imperatore near the Alps. And, curiously, the Sword of Islam mysteriously disappeared. A few months later, though, the Germans managed to break Mussolini out of prison, sending him over to Germany to meet with Hitler. Hitler wanted Mussolini to return to Italy in order to get revenge on the people that had forced him out of power, but Mussolini was reluctant. But in the end, Mussolini ended up being convinced to return to Italy and set up a new regime in northern Italy, establishing the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini would stay in northern Italy for a couple years, as the war in Italy ended up in stalemate. But in 1945, the Allies managed to break the stalemate, pushing north. Fearing that he would be captured, Mussolini began making plans on escaping to Spain, where he would likely reside at least until the end of the war. However, before he could escape, Mussolini ended up being captured by Italian communists, who then promptly took him to a remote facility, shooting and killing him on April 8, 1945. A few weeks later, the Allies would end up defeating Germany, securing victory in the European theater of World War II, and Italy, about a year later, would end up abolishing its monarchy in a narrow referendum, becoming the Republic of Italy. And in 1947, Italy would then be forced to relinquish any and all claims to Libya, which would then be occupied by the Allied powers until 1951, when Libya gained independence, creating the Kingdom of Libya, which would survive for another 18 years before, in 1969, the country would end up under the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Mussolini managed to escape from northern Italy and avoid being executed? Mussolini would immediately leave for Spain, where he would be harbored by Francisco Franco at least until the end of the war. Mussolini likely would have wanted to return to Italy after the war, but it's very likely that Italy would have put him under exile, banning him from returning to the country. And so, Mussolini stays in Spain, where he lives out the rest of his life in relative peace.
Mussolini was left bitter after his defeat, as he was forced into exile and banished from the country he once ruled. He blamed the Allies for his situation and so took it upon himself to do anything and everything in his power to cause trouble for his old enemies. Once Libya gained independence in 1951 and Allied troops withdrew from the region, Mussolini saw his opportunity, using Libyan independence as a platform to push for the decolonization of the African continent. He began making plans for a visit to Libya where he would rally the local Arab population behind the cause of decolonization in hopes that the Libyan people would force their governments to take action against the neighboring colonial powers of Britain and France. And so Mussolini set out and boarded a boat bound for Tripoli, not knowing how derailed his visit would become. Mussolini would give a few speeches in Tripoli decrying Britain and France's insistence on occupying unwilling people, demanding that they give them independence, and after making his appearance in Tripoli, Mussolini would begin making his way to neighboring regions, traveling through the desert with his group of bodyguards and a small group of trusted local supporters. But as they traveled, a heavy sandstorm picked up, separating Mussolini from his group and leaving him stranded in the Libyan Sahara. After being stranded in the desert, Mussolini finds that the only thing he can do is wander around, looking for any signs of civilization. However, after wandering through the desert for days on end, all he manages to find is a small cave where he decides to take shelter until he's hopefully found. A few weeks pass, but no one comes, and just as he's about to lay himself down to accept his fate, he hears a voice. He can't tell whether it's near or far, but he knows it's speaking to him. "Mussolini," it calls out. "I am Allah, the God of this world who has spoken through the Prophet Muhammad. I have seen your suffering in the desert and your many struggles in years previous. I have seen your rise and fall in Italia and your exile in Iberia, and I have also seen your support for my people and my word, as you are the protector of Islam. I have given you inspiration in the past for your rebuilding of an empire of antiquity, but you were ignorant, believing that that empire was to be that of the Romans. No, instead I say to you, you are to restore the empire of the Carthaginians, drive out the Western occupiers, and bring glory to my name, for you are Mussolini, the new Caliph and my chosen deliverer of a new Carthage." After hearing these words, Mussolini immediately bent down in awe and at that very moment converted to Islam, realizing what he needed to do. A few moments later, Mussolini heard another voice, but this time a man's. He stepped out of the cave and saw a group of men traveling together through the desert. Mussolini ran toward them, begging for any food or water they could spare, asking for directions back to Tripoli, where conveniently those men happened to be heading. While on their journey, Mussolini explained his experience in the cave, and although the men didn't believe him at first, thinking the desert heat had gotten to him, they eventually came to believe, becoming the first followers of what would become known as Mussolite Islam.
Mussolite Islam, or as the Western media would eventually dub it, Musalam, was an entirely new branch of Islam which proclaimed Mussolini as the new caliph after the position had been abolished after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and espoused the hierarchy of Allah, Muhammad, Mussolini. Once Mussolini returned to Tripoli, he immediately began to spread the word of his encounters, but most people, at least at first, assumed that he had either finally lost it, or that this was just another ploy to gain their support. But some listened and converted. As time passed and Mussolini stayed in Libya, more and more people eventually began to convert as Mussolini proved his conversion to be sincere. As Mussolini's followers began to grow in power, the ruling Senussis worried that, if they became too powerful, they would launch a coup and overthrow the government. And so, they began placing restrictions on Musalam, forcing many of Mussolini's followers out of Tripoli to take refuge in the desert. However, this wouldn't stop them, as Mussolini continued to make shows of force, bringing many locals to his side as they believed him to be a new Muhammad. And as they continued to grow in power, the government would only become more worried as they now outright banned the practice of the religion. This move infuriates Mussolini and his many followers as the country descends into civil war, with the Senussis attempting to crush Musalam and with Mussolini beginning a guerrilla war campaign against the Libyan government. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Mussolites would win a number of decisive victories against the government, who struggled to track them down in the desert, ultimately bringing even more people to support Mussolini. The government would attempt to gain the support of the United States, but the US, wanting to maintain their image of being champions for freedom, not wanting to support an oppressive government, would likely stay out of the fight. Over time, as the Libyan government continues to wear down due to fatigue from constant fighting, and Mussolini's forces continue to grow in number, Mussolini eventually comes out on top, overthrowing the Libyan government in 1956 and being installed as the new Caliph of Libya, creating a new Mussolite state. But he wouldn't stop there. During the war, as Musalam continued to spread both within and outside of Libya, so too did its sentiments of Neo-Carthaginianism, advocating for a new Islamic Carthaginian state to dominate the Mediterranean. In particular, these sentiments gained a strong foothold in Algeria and Tunisia, who were already deep in their own battles for independence from France. After taking power, Mussolini demanded French departure from both Algeria and its occupied areas in Tunisia, and not wanting to waste more time, energy, money, and resources fighting in North Africa, France would be forced to comply, evacuating from Algeria and Tunisia, with Mussolini's troops moving in and occupying the area, seeing little resistance as the local population hopes that this occupation would lead to a new Neo-Carthaginian state. France objected to Mussolini's occupation of those territories as they feared a revived Mussolini regime, but since the local communities had seen general support for Libyan occupation, the rest of the international community didn't care. Mussolini then moved to annex both Tunisia and Algeria, establishing the Caliphate of Carthage, a new Mussolite Neo-Carthaginian state dominating North Africa and the Mediterranean. Shortly after, Mussolini then began efforts to rebuild the city of Carthage to its former glory, renaming the city of Tunis to Carthage and building a new capital on the old city where Mussolini would rule as the Caliph of the Carthaginian state. However, despite the realization of his goal, Mussolini ended up facing a new threat: the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Nasser viewed Mussolini as a fraud and a fake Muslim who only converted as a way to gain support from the Libyans in order to take control. And as Mussolini instituted Musalam as the state religion of Carthage, this threatened Nasser's goal of uniting the Arab world, as Mussolini's position as caliph gave him legitimacy from his followers as the true ruler of the Arab world, and would reject any unification attempt made by Nasser. Mussolini and Nasser ended up in a heated rivalry, as Nasser's pushes for a united Arabia are completely stalled by Mussolini, like an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. In the case of conflict, the United States pledges support to Mussolini, who would become a firm supporter of the Western Bloc against communism, as the US seeks to secure dominance in North Africa. And with the West supporting his enemy, Nasser, who was neutral in the Cold War, might find himself becoming closer with the Soviet Union as a way to counter Mussolini. However, as an Egyptian-Carthaginian war draws ever closer, Mussolini passes away in the mid-1960s, not as an emperor of Rome, but the caliph of a new Carthage. But despite Mussolini's passing, the caliphate manages to live on, as a new caliph is chosen, not just as the successor to Muhammad, but also of Mussolini. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you can also maybe subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.